Whether you plan on making the occasional candle or would like to begin a much larger scale production, it's important to the process to have a dedicated space where you work. I'm not saying there's any necessity for a specific room or separate premises, but it will make your life so much easier to have a functional space where your many tools and materials are close at hand. A rationalized workspace will result in a functional workflow, and this optimization is so important when incorporating a special skill or hobby into our lives. Let's dive into this lesson by identifying your basic equipment requirements. First up is your candle making hardware. This has got to be one of the most exciting sections of the candle making process, other than making the candles themselves. The identification of the equipment you're going to be using. I just love the process of going to the shops and finding my equipment. It felt like such a personal thing, knowing that these random pieces of hardware were going to be the beginning of my exciting new project. So let's begin looking at the things you'll need. There are a variety of heating devices available to us. It goes without saying that in candle making, we will need some sort of heating device to warm wax and cause it to melt. Using your stove at home is a perfectly adequate method for this. I myself have invested in a small camping cooker that uses a can of propane gas to fuel it. This is a nice way to work too because it allows me to set up my heating space at the most optimal section of the counter for the workflow process. Gas is also known for being a source of instant heat and thereby heats water faster. If you aren't working in your kitchen, but rather in a dedicated candle making area elsewhere in your home, I'd recommend one of these. They're small and efficient for production. Another option available for heating wax is an electric wax melting pot. This is designed specifically to heat and melt the wax to a particular temperature. They're quite pricey owing to their specialized function, but if you get to a point where you are producing larger quantities of candles and need a larger melting capacity and easier workflow, this would be an amazing investment. They work similarly to an electric water urn and will heat the wax to a prescribed temperature and then maintain it there so that you don't overheat. We've spoken about double boilers in our lesson on candle terminology, but let's quickly recap that information. What double boilers are pots that rest inside one another with a layer of water in between. The water is heated inside the outside pot, thus preventing the second pot, which holds your wax, from having direct contact to the heat source. The steam created by the boiling water in the lower pot heats the top pot and melts the wax that it's holding. Double boilers like this can be bought at most catering supply companies as they are also used in cooking for making sauces. However, should you not want to invest too heavily into this particular item of equipment just yet, you can easily do what I do and use a pot you have at home. You add some water and can then use another smaller vessel of your choice inside that to hold the wax. Personally, I use an oven-proof glass measuring jug. I do this because when I lift it slightly, I can see how much of the wax at the bottom still needs to be melted, or if it's melted all the way through. The measurements are also clearly marked on the side of the jug as opposed to some measuring apparatus that marks it indistinctly on the inside. It is also very common, though, to use a metal jug like the one baristas use to foam milk for coffee. These are of course ideal as they transfer heat well and don't easily break or melt. Either way, if you used a glass jug, metal jug, or even a smaller pot that balances inside the outer one, you have to be careful when using the handle. This will undoubtedly have heated up along with all the other contents of the inside pot, so use protective gear when touching it. A side note on using another pot is that this would be less ideal than either of your jug options. Remember, you're going to have to pour the wax into another container, and using something with an easy pouring lip is definitely preferable to prevent spills. Because candle making is a fairly exact science, ascertaining correct temperatures are exceptionally important. Every wax has a different melting point. Every scent, color, and other additive has a specific temperature at which it must be added so that it functions effectively in conjunction with the wax. For all of this to be achieved, you will need a reliable thermometer. Something to note is that a pharmacy thermometer designed for taking people's temperature doesn't work. Those thermometers only go up to a temperature that is reasonable in a human being. The waxes we're melting will need to reach temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius. This leaves us with two main options, the first being a meat thermometer and the second being a candy thermometer. Again, as with double boilers, these will be readily available at most catering and homeware supply stores. Meat thermometers can be digital or analog, the digital option being something that works rather well in candle wax. Analog versions that I've tried, however, don't seem to respond well to the thin substance of the wax. My preferred option is a candy thermometer, like the one used to make sweets and desserts. What's great about these is that they have a scale, the numbers that appear to tell you where the different temperature is indicated, and a working liquid, which is the liquid that rises up to the numbers to show you what kind of heat you're looking at. What's wonderful about these is that most of them can be clipped to the side of your jar and remain in your wax while it's melting. This way, you don't have to take the temperature again and again, but can simply check the reading on the thermometer every few minutes to see how hot the liquid is. If you have invested in a wax melting pot, however, this additional equipment will not be a necessary purchase. Melting pots have built-in thermometers to make sure the wax reaches its optimum temperature and makes it unnecessary to check this manually. Since your creations will require some stirring and mixing at certain points, you will need to have a dedicated mixing item. If you are making multiple candle types at once, you will need multiple mixers. Using something like a wooden spoon as one might in baking isn't a great idea. This is simply because whatever you are using to mix your wax will be a surface area that the wax will cling to, and the larger the surface area, the more of your raw materials you'll lose. I like to use bamboo or wooden lolly sticks. They're fairly cheap, so I don't feel bad throwing them away afterwards instead of adding to the pile of equipment I'll need to clean up after. If you're someone who is used to mixing when you cook, you may find yourself tempted to use a whisk in an attempt to better combine additives with your wax. This is, however, not a good idea, as I discovered when thinking I'd be clever and do the same thing, because whisking adds far too much air to your mixture and results in increased air bubbles and pockets in your poured candle. The additives will combine on their own with gentle stirring, so long as the wax has been heated to the correct temperature. A big consideration for your equipment shopping list will be your measuring jugs, cups, and beakers. You'll need larger sized measuring jugs for your wax, since this will always be your largest content portion. Remember though, you need to be able to pick up your jug of molten liquid at some point to be able to pour it, so don't invest in anything with a larger capacity than what you can easily lift when it's full. You'll need a smaller set of measuring cups for dry additives like dye or stearic acid, and another for your wet additives. I prefer to use a small glass measuring beaker when I'm measuring out fragrance oil, as they have very nice pouring lips for adding the liquid to your wax. It's also a great plan to invest in some inexpensive plastic pipettes. If you're only making a small number of candles, you may just want to use these for measuring out liquid additives. They tend to only go up to 3 milliliters though, so depending on how much liquid you're adding, this may or may not be a functional capacity for you. My main reason for using them is that they suck up the oily liquid that remains in the beaker once I've poured from it. Fragrance oil can be very viscous and takes a while to move. This is a pretty pricey additive and not something one wants to waste. So using a pipette to suck up any remaining liquid in the jar and then adding it to the heated wax is a thrifty consideration. Some candle recipes or guides use molten liquid measures, while others refer to the weight of specific waxes. For this reason, having a good quality digital kitchen scale is important. You want to be able to measure out accurate weights of wax flakes or bars and know that your quantities are just right. This next item isn't a necessity, but it is definitely a convenience to have. Wick clips are a newer addition to the candle making supply world. These are essentially support structures that can be placed to balance on top of jar candles while being created. They are used for cotton wicked candles and have a hole in the center through which the wick is inserted. Their structure means they will rest in a position that will center and maintain the upright position of a wick while the wax is freshly poured and the candle is busy setting. You can also make your own devices to hold a wick upright though. Making a small hole in an ice lolly stick will perform a similar function in terms of keeping the wick upright. However, this homemade version will not necessarily ensure that your wick is in the exact center of your candle jar. In this next section, we'll speak about our raw materials. Naturally, this section is going to be very dependent on the type of candle you're going to make. Throughout the duration of this course, you will be learning various different ways to make candles and expand on the scope of each different type of candle. Each type of candle will require different raw materials. However, some of the raw materials required will be standard, so let's look at what you'll generally need to maintain in your stock cupboard. First and foremost will be your wax. Having an adequate supply of wax on hand is a practical necessity. It's also important to note that most stores will reduce the price per kilogram of wax when you buy more. For instance, buying 10 kilograms of wax will work out cheaper per kilogram than buying a single kilogram. For this reason, and to save on shipping costs by ordering small quantities, but then having to do it repeatedly, I like to order a substantial amount of wax to store where I'm working. There is very little that is more frustrating than being halfway through a candling session and running out of wax to finalize a project. In addition, melted wax reduces to about half the volume of its unmelted size, so the amount you see when buying it raw looks far more vast than what it will translate to upon melting for use. It's good to note too that wax should ideally be stored in an airtight container of sorts to keep any dust or insects from making a home in there. We want our wax to stay as clean as possible, so correct storage is an important consideration. Our next necessity is the stock of your wicks. We spent a long time in our previous lesson on wicks discussing the many options. When starting out, you may want to order a variety of wick types so that you can experiment with their different functions and find your favorite. Once you've done this, I'd also advise keeping stock on hand so that you aren't halted during production when having to place an order for more. You'll also later discover the type of additives you wish to make use of. Some are more functional, like stearic acid, and others, like fragrance and color additives, are aesthetic. Once you discover what you'd like to be using consistently, however, I would recommend stocking up and keeping a good amount of these on hand. Fragrance oils, like wax, will sometimes become cheaper when buying a larger quantity, so buying more at a time if you plan on making larger quantities of stock makes good financial sense. Next up are our vessels and mold. If you aren't going to limit your candle making to the rolled beeswax candles we made, or the dipped candles we will be making in your next lesson, you will need to make use of either containers in which to make your candles, or molds with which to achieve the desired shape of your candle. There are hundreds of options to choose from should you go with either one of these routes. A candle vessel could be a jar, sturdy drinking glasses, a mug, a cement holder, a ceramic of sorts. The list goes on and on. Initially, it's a great idea to play around with a variety of these options to see how the various waxes perform in your chosen vessel, and if they provide you with the ultimate aesthetic and function you'd like them to. Candle molds can be bought from craft stores and online, and the selection of shapes available is overwhelming. They will also be made from a variety of different materials such as metal, plastic, or silicone. Here's a pro tip relating to what we've just discussed. With most of the molds you'll use, something handy to buy and keep with your candle making supplies is mold release. This is a spray that you can use before pouring wax into a mold. It's similar to the oven or baking spray that you'd use to prime cake tins before pouring in the batter. Mold release adds a layer to the inside of the mold, which would make sure your candle doesn't adhere to the side while the wax dries, and also allows an easier release of the set candle from the mold at a later stage. To reflect on the information we've just obtained, let's do a few slides to test your memory. Number 1 down. Which piece of equipment is used to establish the exact temperature of the melted wax? The correct answer is A. Thermometer. Number 2 down. Name a normal household appliance that can be used to heat wax. Most commonly, we could say a stove. Number 3 down. Name a handy device to keep the wick in place while candles wax cools. Did you guess right? It's a wick clip. Number 4 across. Name the type of pot we would use to melt wax. Our answer, of course, is a double boiler. We're now going to begin our section on how to create a home candling station. Firstly, let's talk about the ways in which you could think of organizing your supplies. If you're like me and like organization and structure, setting up your candle work and storage areas will be a gleeful exercise in creative aesthetics. I make my candles from home, so in an attempt to not lose track of where things are and forget what I have available to me, I like to keep everything I need for the candle making process in one cupboard. I have clear storage boxes that house my various raw materials and equipment, so that if I'm checking my stock levels or looking for something, I know where it should be. A great way to stay organized is to go down to your local storage or plastics shop and see what container systems they have available. Waxes are often sent in large bags. What I've seen done is that people have invested in plastic dustbins, almost like feed bins on farms, where they store their wax and can easily scoop it out to work with. If you're working with multiple wax mediums, this is a great way to keep them separate but on hand for whichever project you're working on. Storage of your materials can be done in virtually any of the ways one might organize storage in a kitchen or grocery cupboard. If you'd like to store your different wicks all pre-cut at the correct length and ready for use, you could use glass jars to store them side by side like you would pasta or legumes. Kind of like a candle making pantry. If you want to keep these items separate and ready for use in a drawer, then standard drawer dividing inserts work well. It's also a great idea to mark everything, jars, drawers, shelves, with the exact nature of what it holds and the date on which it was bought so that you can keep track of your stock in this manner. Your storage and workspace can be a work of art all on its own, and it should be an inspiring area that invites you and nourishes your time while working there. Let's now chat about how to best protect your work area. It's fairly logical that candle making can be a messy process. Spills are part of the deal, unfortunately, so it's always a good idea to make sure that your working surfaces are protected from heat and liquid damage. I would never suggest working at something like a dining room table where hot wax could damage the expensive wood. I'd instead advise working somewhere that has a plastic worktop of sorts. Marble or granite kitchen countertops are okay too in terms of their ability to withstand heat. But should you need to scrape paraffin wax from them at a later stage, you might risk scratching the facade. While a plastic tabletop is the best option, these too can be scratched during any scraping. What I would do, regardless of where you work, is invest in a heavy-duty plastic sheet used for painting drop cloths. You could find these at most hardware stores. While it isn't going to look pretty, the functionality of keeping your surfaces from being destroyed by oils, wax, cuts, and heat is necessary to most of us, so setting yourself up this way from the start will save you a lot of frustration. Lighting and ventilation will also play a role in the setup of a good workspace. As with most forms of creative project, adequate light is a must. Working somewhere dark and badly lit has an adverse effect on your mood and creativity, and also puts unnecessary strain on your eyes, which over the long term can damage them. Try to work somewhere that the light source is above your hands so you have a good view of what you're working on. Having a light source behind you will cause you to be looking down into the shadow created by your body, blocking the light source. This is something that may also affect your vision over the long term. It's also important to have adequate ventilation from a fresh air source. The melting of the wax itself doesn't give off too much of a smell, although things can heat up with all the steam and warmth being generated. The main reason good ventilation or having a bit of air movement is important to me is when using the fragrance oil additives. When working with them for a few hours at a time in large quantities, I find I'm rather overpowered by the scent and my sinuses suffer a bit. In addition, smelling something potent for a long time can also diminish your sensitivity to it and ruin the scent for you entirely. Needless to say, ventilation is always a good idea. Very importantly, we're going to now discuss logical workflow. What you ideally want to create is a logical flow. This means understanding how you'll most likely be moving across your station for different activities and what the most rational way would be to move so that you don't waste your energy resources by doing things in an impractical way. Consider some of the activities necessary in making a candle from start to finish. Initially, you'll be preparing your raw materials, perhaps cutting wicks to the correct size, wiping out canisters or molds. Within that, you'll perhaps also be fixing wicks to the bottom of the containers or inserting a wick into a mold and sealing off the ends. This is something we could group together in one section. After that, you'll need to be measuring, weighing, and ultimately melting your chosen wax. This will require you to be at your heat source and have space around you for the various measuring cups and wax containers. Depending on the type of candle you intend to make, you may need a section to set up separate measuring cups and jugs for fragrance and color dye. You won't be able to use the same measuring cups you used for the wax and should rather have dedicated vessels for color or fragrance. Otherwise, you'll waste valuable energy going back and forth to wash and dry them again and again. Also, if you're working with more than one color or fragrance, you'll need to have measuring cups for each one. In my personal experience, there's nothing worse than having to wash, rinse, and dry a measuring cup because you're making two separate fragranced candles. Additionally, you run the risk of confusing what you've used. Since fragrances are all pretty similar in color, it's happened before at the tail end of a long night spent making candles, being in the fragrance and working with it for hours on end. My judgment of the scent was no longer accurate. I've poured the wrong scent into the designated beaker, mixed two, and ruined entire batches that way. Now I label the measuring cups I'm working with, using the name of the scent so that I don't have to guess. The process of candle making can be a long one, and these small conveniences make a world of difference in your production time, effort, and accuracy. Once your wax is melted and you've added any relevant additives, you'll need to move to a pouring section where your molds or vessels are wicked, set up, and waiting. Ideally, you want this section to be slightly distanced from where you were preparing these materials, as the pouring can get messy and spill on your raw materials still in stock. From the pouring station, you'll need to move the candles you've just created to a designated curing area. This should ideally be somewhere that you can close them off to prevent dust from settling on them. Since the curing process can take anywhere from 24 hours to 2 weeks depending on the candle you are making, you'll need to investigate how much space you need to have for the number of candles you intend to make. A shelf, cupboard, book rack, or set of stacking plastic drawers could all be good options for this. Just make sure they remain somewhere that doesn't get any direct sunlight and doesn't expose them to a draft that can carry dust. In the case of taper candles, you'll need somewhere to hang them up to cure. This is slightly more of a challenge, but an empty clothing cupboard is a good option, as you could suspend the candles from the clothing rail. Lastly, and this depends on what you intend on doing with your candles, would be a packaging station. This is where you'll have any and all of the items you need to package your product. This also includes things like labels, safety stickers, usage instructions, boxes, ribbons, and so on. Having a rational packaging station will also allow you to move through the process quickly and efficiently, without having to go searching for the tools or materials you need to finish off your candle. It isn't, however, important that this area is in the same space as your creation space, as your packaging will most likely happen at a different time to the making of the candle. Let's take a look at the following illustration to help you better understand a logical flow between the different areas you'll set up during the production of your candle. We begin at our preparation station, then move to our measuring section. From here, we'll go to our heat source, perhaps moving sideways to our additives, then back to the heat. Now we'll move back over to our pouring section. Do you see how well that worked? Here's a helpful hint for you. Candle making is a long process and can require a lot of time on your feet. Something you may like to invest in to give your legs, feet, and back a bit of relief is an anti-fatigue mat of sorts. What this is a type of heavy-duty padding that you can stand on to relieve pressure in the body when standing for long periods of time. It might sound silly, but after the many hours I've spent on my feet making candles, I really feel that any kind of relief to the demands on your body is welcome and a clever investment in yourself and in your candles. We've already covered so much information today. Let's take a moment to rest our minds before we continue with this exciting lesson. And while we do that, I'll introduce Lesson 7 to you. In our next session together, we will be working with paraffin wax for the very first time. Together, we're going to create dipped taper candles in your new home candle making station and add a new practical skill to your candle making arsenal. This will be the second time during this first module that you will be physically creating a candle, and I couldn't be more excited to see you progress to this new level of expertise. For now though, let's return to our lesson by discussing the various safety precautions it's necessary for you to recognize. Let's begin by talking about your working with heat and heat sources. While the risks of starting a fire while you're working to make your candles are minimal, when we're working with gas or electricity combined with combustible chemical additives such as fragrance oils, it is better to be prepared with both knowledge and tools to be able to deal with it. Anyone working with a heat source should be furnished with the appropriate know-how when it comes to fire safety. Kitchen staff in restaurants and hotels are equipped to attempt to deal with unfortunate incidents like this. And since candle makers are most frequently working in some form of kitchen, it's our responsibility to take on this care too. Ideally, every home and business should be in possession of a fire extinguisher, a bucket of sand, or even an open pack of baking soda while you're working. The fire extinguisher needs to be serviced and checked for functionality on an annual basis and should be kept somewhere that is easy to reach should the need arise. In the event of an electrical fire at the stove or at a plug point, it is most important to note that you must never try to extinguish this with water. For the most part, it is generally thought best to leave the premises immediately and alert emergency services of what is happening rather than to risk injury by handling it yourself. Should you decide to attempt to put it out yourself, you should still call emergency services first to alert them to your issue and be sure to let them know that you are dealing with an electrical fire. This is something you will need to discern at the moment. Should the fire still be very small though and you want to take action to prevent further damage, see if your main electrical board is within clear access. If it is and doesn't cause you to put yourself away from an exit behind the fire, check that you can see 2 clear exits from where you will be, then head to the board and turn off the electricity to the premises. Once you've done this and prevented current from flowing into the building, check again whether it is still safe for you to be on site. If even one of your exits has become blocked, leave immediately. If the fire is still confined to a small area though, like a plug point or adapter, you can now consider trying to extinguish it. Since the power is now off, you have a few options. You can at this point use water to extinguish any flames. This may cause damage to surrounding areas though, so this next option would be my ideal go-to. Baking soda is made up of a chemical compound known as sodium bicarbonate, which is a key ingredient in fire extinguishers. It's also an easy enough thing to keep open next to your workspace to help in emergency scenarios like this. You can pour this out over the flames to suffocate them. Using sand in the same manner will also work, as it will deprive the flames of oxygen and prevent them from growing, then ultimately suffocate them entirely. In the event of a gas fire, the same initial protocol needs to be followed. Your first priority is always to call emergency services to let them know of the issue and remove yourself from the situation should you feel you may not be able to handle it. If you do feel able to prevent the spread of the fire, begin by checking for 2 clear exit ways and then trying to turn off the main supply of gas by closing the line. Once you've ensured the gas is no longer flowing, your options to douse the flames are as follows. Wet and throw a soaking cloth over the flames to deprive them of the oxygen they would need to spread. If you have sand handy, this is also something that can be used to smother them. It's however very important to note that gas fires can be extinguished by water, but the amount you use needs to be excessive. You cannot throw a little water onto a gas fire as this will actually help it spread. So don't throw a mug of water onto the flames and think this will help. Only use water if you know that you have enough on hand to really overwhelm the fire. These are unlikely unhappy events to think of, but it is also so important that you have this knowledge in the hope that you never have to use it, rather than the other way around. Now let's become aware of some of the heat protection protective equipment that will be helpful to you. All talk of fire-related accidents aside, we will be working with hot equipment and open flames too. It's always a good idea to equip yourself with certain items of PPE, or personal protective equipment. Most people will already have a pot holder in their homes or even prefer to use a towel, but I would recommend investing in a good silicone pot holder. On one occasion, I was using a gas stove to heat the pot I was using as the base of the double boiling setup, and I picked up the pot by its metal handles, not realizing they had been heated instead of just the base as I was expecting. My hands were blistered and tender for weeks. A pot holder might sound like a silly old-fashioned investment, but honestly, after this incident, I realized that when one is working quickly and repetitively, accidents can happen. Metal holders and glass jugs will invariably be too hot to handle at some stage, so having the basic item available to you is a must. An alternative to this is to invest in some good quality heat-resistant gloves. If they're flexible enough, you can use them throughout your melting and pouring process so that any wax you may spill or steam that may escape from the double boiling also doesn't end up scorching your skin. Something I always have on hand in the house is a simple, inexpensive burn cream. There are many brands available, and you can check your local pharmacy for what is available in your region. Having this in the house means that should you spill some wax or have a hot pot incident, as I did, you can treat the area immediately. Burns on our skin are an interesting type of wound because they continue to spread even after you remove them from the heat source. Your skin transfers heat onwards within itself. This is why it's so important to run the affected area under cold water for an extended period of time, and then use a burn-appropriate cream or salve to treat it. It's also important to speak about the necessity to work out of the way of small children and animals. Many of us might live and now be working on our candle craft in homes where children and animals are present. This is, of course, something that we need to take into consideration when working with heat and flames. Working on top of counter space is usually helpful in terms of making sure that most products are out of reach of small kids. We do need to pay attention to the classic rules of the kitchen when it comes to children, though, and never leave anything that can be reached or tugged down protruding from the edge of a counter. If you are using a saucepan as part of the double boiler, ensure that the handle is turned away from the edge of your heat source and can't be seen by little eyes from below. While the vegetable waxes aren't toxic should they be ingested, paraffin wax and most candle additives most certainly are. It may be better to invest in a safety gate that can be used to block the doorway to where you're working. Toddler and pet gates are easily available from many stores and provide an impermanent barrier. Something like this gives you peace of mind. Waxes, dye, and additive powders and any number of things could end up on the floor and be ingested by a small child or pet. So making sure your work area is secure in terms of access is a very practical necessity. It needs to be specified that you should never leave melting wax in a pot alone. Again, this may seem like common sense to most of us, but it's of vital importance to mention that you should never leave anything exposed to direct heat alone while you're working on it. Wax can sometimes take a while to fully melt, and it would be very easy to walk away and leave it to do so, then come back to look later. This kind of risk simply isn't worth it. Forgetting a stove on or not seeing the wax begin to bubble and overflow, or having a toddler or animal enter your workspace are all things that could happen. When you begin working, make sure you are fully prepared to be present for the duration of the process.